There is a tree whose bark was scraped, dried, and carried into battle by soldiers who had no hospitals, no pharmacies, no IV drips. A tree whose inner bark was ground into powder and used in American hospitals as a standard treatment for some of the most brutal gut conditions known to medicine. It was in the official Pharmacopeia. Doctors prescribed it. Pharmacies stocked it on the front shelf alongside aspirin and iodine. Now, no government agency promotes it. No major hospital recommends it. The pharmaceutical industry has spent decades quietly replacing it with synthetic alternatives that treat the symptoms, but never address the cause. This is not a fringe herb. This is not folk superstition. This is a plant that was standard, mainstream medicine for over a century, and then it disappeared. This is the story of Slippery Elm. And once you understand what it does, you will understand exactly why it had to go. In the forests of eastern North America, from the Appalachians to the Great Plains, there grows a tree called Ulmus rubra, the slippery elm. It reaches 60 feet tall, with rough, deeply furrowed bark and leaves like coarse sandpaper. Nothing about it looks remarkable from the outside. But peel back the outer bark. What you find underneath is extraordinary. The inner bark of slippery elm is covered in mucilage, a thick, gel-like substance that when mixed with water becomes slippery and viscous, almost like raw egg white. The indigenous peoples of North America discovered this property thousands of years ago. The Ojibwe used it, the Cherokee used it, the Iroquois used it. Across dozens of nations, the inner bark of this tree was one of the most important healing substances in their pharmacopeia. They used it for wounds. They used it for burns. They used it for sore throats. But most critically, they used it for the gut, for stomach pain, for inflammation of the bowels, for the kind of chronic digestive suffering that can make a person's life unlivable. When European settlers arrived, they watched, they learned, and they adopted slippery elm completely. By the 1700s, it was standard frontier medicine. Settlers ground the dried bark into powder, mixed it with water to form a gruel, and fed it to sick children, the elderly, and anyone suffering from internal inflammation. It was one of the few medicines available in remote areas, and it worked well enough that it became a staple of every household. By the 1800s, it was no longer just folk medicine. It was medical medicine. The United States Pharmacopeia, the official government compendium that defines legitimate medicines, listed slippery elm bark as an approved remedy. That is not a small thing. That is the federal government, through its scientific body, recognizing this bark as a valid therapeutic agent. Pharmacies across the country stocked it in lozenges, powders, and teas. Doctors prescribed it by name. Hospitals kept it in their dispensaries, alongside drugs we still use today. This is the fact that gets buried when people dismiss herbal medicine. Slippery elm was not alternative. It was not fringe. It was mainstream medicine for over a century. And the reason it worked then is the same reason it works now, because the biology never changed. To understand why slippery elm is remarkable, you need to understand what most gut treatments actually do. Antacids neutralize stomach acid. They reduce a symptom, the burning, without addressing why the acid is causing damage in the first place. Proton pump inhibitors suppress acid production entirely, which creates its own cascade of long-term problems, including nutrient deficiencies and rebound hypersecretion. Probiotics add bacteria to the gut, which can be valuable, but they do nothing to address a damaged gut lining. Fiber supplements bulk up stool and can ease transit, but again, they do not repair the tissue itself. All of these treatments work around the gut lining. Slippery elm works on it. The mucilage in slippery elm bark, primarily a complex carbohydrate called arabinogalactin, does something that no pharmaceutical currently on the market does. When you swallow it, it physically coats the mucous membranes of the esophagus, stomach, and intestines. It forms a protective gel layer directly over the damaged tissue. It does not suppress a symptom. It does not add a chemical reaction. It physically shields the tissue while the body heals itself. Think of it like this. If you had a wound on your hand, you could take a painkiller to stop the sensation of pain, or you could put a bandage over the wound to protect it while it heals. Antacids are the painkiller. Slippery elm is the bandage. Except the bandage is made of a substance so biologically compatible with your own mucous membranes that your body essentially treats it as part of itself. The mucilage also has a secondary effect. It is deeply anti-inflammatory. The compounds in slippery elm bark stimulate the secretion of mucus in the gastrointestinal tract, reinforcing the body's own protective barriers. When you have conditions like gastritis, ulcers, irritable bowel syndrome, or inflammatory bowel disease, the protective mucus layer in your gut has been compromised. The lining is exposed. Every meal, every acid surge, every digestive contraction is touching raw, inflamed tissue. Slippery elm helps restore that layer. This is why historical practitioners used it for exactly the conditions that modern gastroenterology struggles with most: chronic indigestion, gastric ulcers, colitis, the kind of gut inflammation that never fully resolves, that flares and retreats and makes every day an exhausting negotiation between what you can eat and what will make you sick. No pills, no lab synthesis, no chemical reactions that create new imbalances while treating old ones. Just bark, water, and a mechanism of action so direct it almost seems too simple to be real. But simple does not mean primitive. Sometimes it means elegant. In 1862, as the Civil War tore the country apart and medical supplies ran desperately short, field surgeons turned to whatever they could find. Slippery elm bark was used to soothe the digestive systems of soldiers suffering from camp dysentery, a condition that killed more men in that war than bullets did. It was used as a poultice for infected wounds. It was part of the improvised medicine of an improvised war, but it was not improvised knowledge. By that point, American physicians had been using slippery elm for generations. The eclectic physicians, a major school of American medicine in the 19th century that integrated botanical and conventional treatments, considered slippery elm one of their most reliable tools. Worcester Beach, one of the founders of eclectic medicine, wrote about it extensively. John King, whose American Eclectic Dispensatory was a standard medical reference, described its specific applications for gastrointestinal inflammation in clinical detail. These were not herbalists sitting outside the medical mainstream. They were licensed physicians with medical degrees, practicing in hospitals, publishing in medical journals, and training the next generation of doctors. Their use of slippery elm was grounded in clinical observation across thousands of patients. Into the early 20th century, slippery elm lozenges were widely available in American pharmacies. You could walk into a drugstore, ask for slippery elm, and leave with a standardized preparation. The knowledge was institutional. The remedy was commercially available. The evidence base, by the standards of the time, was substantial. And then the pharmaceutical revolution arrived, and everything changed. Here is where the story of slippery elm diverges from a simple narrative of suppression. The truth is more complicated, and in some ways, more damning. Slippery elm did not disappear because it stopped working. The plant did not change. The human gut did not change. The mucilage still coats, still soothes, still protects, exactly as it always has. Slippery elm disappeared for 3 reasons that have nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with economics. The first reason is the trees themselves. Harvesting slippery elm bark kills the tree. The medicinal bark is the inner bark. To access it in sufficient quantities, you have to strip the tree, and a stripped tree dies. As demand for slippery elm exploded in the 19th century, and as settlers cleared eastern forests at an astonishing rate, slippery elm populations collapsed. By the early 1900s, the raw material was becoming genuinely scarce. You cannot build an industry on a depleted resource, and nobody invested in sustainable cultivation before it was too late. The second reason is patents. You cannot patent a tree. You cannot patent the inner bark of Ulmus rubra. It has been in continuous use for centuries across multiple cultures. It is public domain in the most fundamental sense of the term. A pharmaceutical company cannot take slippery elm, put its name on it, and charge what the market will bear. There is no proprietary claim. There is no intellectual property. There is no profit moat. What pharmaceutical companies can do is take the concept, a substance that coats and soothes the gut lining, isolate one active component, modify it chemically, patent the modification, and sell that at 100 times the price of bark powder, which is, in various forms, exactly what they have done. The third reason is standardization. Modern pharmaceutical production requires absolute consistency. Every pill must contain exactly the same amount of exactly the same compounds. Natural plant material does not work that way. Bark from a tree grown in Virginia has a different chemical profile than bark from a tree grown in Michigan. Bark harvested in spring differs from bark harvested in fall. This variability is not a flaw. It reflects the living complexity of the plant. But it is a problem for an industry built on the assumption that medicine must be uniform to be valid. So the transition was not a conspiracy so much as an economic and structural logic that made botanical medicine systematically less attractive to invest in, less profitable to produce, and less legible to a system that equated standardization with science. The result was the same as if it had been a conspiracy. Slippery Elm disappeared from mainstream medicine within a generation. The pharmacopeias dropped it. Medical schools stopped teaching it. Physicians who trained after 1950 never learned it existed. The institutional memory of a century of clinical use simply evaporated, and the patients who might have benefited from it were given antacids instead. Consider what it means to have a generation of patients with chronic gut conditions. And chronic gut conditions are epidemic now, affecting tens of millions of people who are treated exclusively with pharmaceutical options that manage symptoms rather than address the underlying barrier disruption. The gut lining is not incidental to health. It is foundational. When the mucosal barrier is compromised, inflammation spreads, nutrient absorption is impaired. The immune system, 70% of which resides in the gut, is constantly activated. Conditions that seem to have nothing to do with the gut, skin problems, mood disorders, autoimmune conditions, fatigue, have been shown to correlate strongly with gut barrier dysfunction. Slippery Elm does not cure these conditions. It is not a magic pill, but it addresses the physical substrate, the damaged lining itself, in a way that nothing currently in mainstream medicine does at the same level of simplicity, safety, and cost. It has essentially no toxicity. There are no known serious drug interactions. It is safe during pregnancy. Historical practitioners used it specifically for pregnancy nausea. It is safe for children. It cannot be overdosed in any practical sense. The worst that typically happens when someone takes too much is that it interferes with the absorption of medications taken at the same time, which is why practitioners recommend spacing it from other medicines by 2 hours. That safety profile is extraordinary. Most gut pharmaceuticals carry significant risk profiles. Proton pump inhibitors, when used long-term, are associated with magnesium deficiency, B12 deficiency, kidney disease, and increased risk of C. difficile infection. These are not rare complications. They are documented in the medical literature. The drugs are still prescribed because for many patients, the benefits outweigh the risks. But if there were a safe, effective, sustainable option that carried none of those risks, should it not at least be part of the conversation? It is not part of the conversation. It is not taught in medical schools. It is not recommended by gastroenterologists. It lives in health food stores and herbal remedy corners, classified by the FDA as a demulcent, a substance that soothes mucous membranes, but not as a treatment for anything, because demonstrating that classification requires clinical trials that cost tens of millions of dollars that no one will fund for a plant they cannot patent. The knowledge survived, but barely. In Appalachian folk medicine, the knowledge never fully died. Herbalists who trained in the old traditions, women who learned from their grandmothers, who learned from theirs, kept Slippery Elm in their practice when the medical schools abandoned it. They used it for the same things practitioners had always used it for, and their patients improved, and they kept using it. In the natural medicine revival of the 1970s and 80s, Slippery Elm was rediscovered by a new generation. Today, it is back in health food stores. It is used by naturopathic physicians. Herbalists prescribe it routinely. A small but growing body of modern research is confirming the mechanisms that traditional practitioners observed empirically over centuries. A 2002 pilot study found that a formula containing Slippery Elm was effective in reducing IBS symptoms, including bowel irregularity, bloating, and abdominal pain. Research on its constituent compounds, arabinogalactans, beta-glucans, polysaccharides, shows anti-inflammatory activity and prebiotic effects, meaning the mucilage also feeds beneficial gut bacteria, making Slippery Elm both a protector of the gut lining and a nourisher of the microbial communities that live there. This dual mechanism, protective coating plus microbiome support, is something pharmaceutical gut treatments rarely achieve simultaneously. You take a probiotic for one thing and an anti-inflammatory for another. Slippery Elm does both, as a single plant, the same way it has for 10,000 years. Notice what is not happening. No pharmaceutical company is funding large-scale clinical trials for Slippery Elm. No government agency is promoting it as part of gut health guidelines. The scarcity problem, the fact that overharvesting decimated wild populations, remains largely unaddressed because no commercial incentive exists to solve it sustainably. You can buy Slippery Elm powder online and in health stores, but it is almost entirely wild harvested or sourced from small cultivators, and the supply is fragile. The infrastructure that could make this bark widely accessible, sustainably produced, and clinically validated simply does not exist. Not because the knowledge is gone, because the economic model does not reward building it. There is a principle in traditional medicine systems across the world, from Ayurveda to indigenous North American practice to the botanical medicine of 19th century America, that the gut is the center of health. What you feed it, what you protect it with, what you allow to damage it. These are not secondary concerns. They are primary. Modern medicine knows this too. The research on the gut-brain axis, on the microbiome, on gut permeability, and systemic inflammation has confirmed, in molecular detail, what traditional practitioners understood through observation. The gut lining is not just a digestive surface. It is an immune organ, a neural interface, a barrier between the interior of your body and the outside world. When that barrier breaks down, the consequences reach everywhere. Slippery Elm was used for centuries because it worked. It worked for the Ojibwe healer and the eclectic physician and the Civil War surgeon and the frontier grandmother making gruel for her sick child. It worked because its mechanism of action is direct, physical, and biologically compatible with the tissue it acts on. The trees still grow in eastern forests. The bark still contains the same mucilage it always has. The mechanism has not changed. The need has not changed. If anything, in an era of ultra-processed food and chronic gut inflammation, the need is greater than it has ever been. The only thing that changed is who gets to decide what counts as medicine. And that decision has never been purely scientific. Every person who learns about Slippery Elm and the century of clinical tradition behind it becomes a little harder to convince that the only valid medicines are the ones on pharmacy shelves. Every practitioner who incorporates it into their work recovers a thread of knowledge that was almost lost. Every sustainable cultivation effort rebuilds a resource that was stripped away before anyone thought to protect it. The bark is still there. The knowledge survived. And the gut, which has been waiting, inflamed, and damaged for something that actually restores what was lost, rather than just managing what remains, is still ready to heal. If this video opened something for you, subscribe to PlantCraft and hit the bell. Every like and every share helps preserve this wisdom.